if you're like tens of hundreds of other Americans, you might remember the 1980s. And if you were a kid in the 1980s, odds are you at some point encountered Masters of the Universe, the toy line from Mattel, or perhaps the animated series from Filmation. Or heck, if you were in Germany, you were probably a big fan of the audio cassette tapes with their original continuity where Trapjaw gets hit by a tank saving a little girl, and oh, it's all crazy. Go watch the other video I have. I'll link it at the end. Anyway, He-Man was reinvented quite a few times over the years after the 1980s, and while there were some versions that had some success, especially with the adult collector market, I'll buy the small adult collector market, it really was getting kids into the brand that was going to have it stick around. And the time when this was at its peak was the 1980s, and He-Man became one of the most iconic toy lines of the 1980s. In fact, it was the it was the best-selling line in 84 and 85. But it did come crashing down, and if you're familiar with the book, for example, from Roger Sweet, one of the original designers of the line, it did have a sudden sort of just fall-off from the cultural radar. So, while Roger is definitely absolutely one of the originators of the line, having created the He-Man trio of 12-inch figures that helped inspire the line, and he came up with the name He-Man, and yes, that is a 1978 Kenner Boba Fett figure as the space version of He-Man. Roger's versions were going to be multiple different, it was every genre. It was more like a Barbie He-Man line, where, you could wear any costume. Well, along came Mark Taylor, who was also a major, designer, creator of the brand. And while he did a lot of work on the actual individual characters, one of the big secrets about who designed the Masters of the Universe toy line is that, well, like almost any toy line, it was really kind of put together from past work. So let me kind of explain. It's sort of that whole copy, paste, repeat that is very, very inherent in the toy industry, and for logical reasons. That being, toy designers work really, really, really hard. They're tasked with coming up with completely original, brand new toy play concepts every year. A perfect example was the Battle Shifters from the Green Lantern movie line, and I promise I'll get back to He-Man in a second, but allow me to illustrate. So these Battle Shifters, which were basically plastic origami, is actually the way it was discussed internally. It was pieces of plastic that folded up, and replicating Green Lantern's powers, you press down and they would pop out into something gigantic. So it could squish down, and then with one touch, suddenly you have a Gatling gun. Well, this plastic origami concept had actually been around for a few years and had been proposed for multiple toy lines. It just could never find a home. So the enormous amount of work creating this wasn't abandoned. It was just repackaged, rebranded, recolored, and sort of pitched multiple times until it found a home. This happens all the time in the toy industry because, again, toy designers are tasked with coming up with huge amounts of innovation every year. So lathering, rinse, and repeat, doing the same thing but in a different color, or a concept that may have gotten rejected a previous year, and repackaging it again, whether or not it made it to market or if it was successful at market, saying, hey, here's a successful concept, well, let's reissue it. So knowing how important that, or how steady that is in the toy industry as far as the creative process using that concept, well, let's take a closer look at Masters of the Universe, because you will note that so many of the characters from the original line from the 80s were essentially repackaged, updated, reimagined versions of previous Mattel toys. So let's start off with old, Boneface himself, Skeletor. And it's known that, Mark Taylor has talked about how the design for Skeletor, the concept of a skull with a hood, had come to him as a child while visiting a haunted house or at a fair, at a traveling carnival, if you will. And a skeleton sort of had come down at him and surprised him, and that image always stuck around. And I've no doubt about the authenticity of that story. But previous to Skeletor, we had this character, the purple hooded skull face Captain Drake from the Big Jim line, which I'm guessing probably Mark Taylor also worked on. So, yes, the story is probably, I'm sure it's true about the Funhouse, but the inspiration for Skeletor also inspired Captain Drake, who came first. And you had this toy, sitting around the Mattel office for, half a decade before Motu came out. Fans have even done customs of Captain Drake as Skeletor to sort of show how similar the toys are, and the fact that, yes, it's basically essentially the same concept, and, just with blue skin and a loincloth instead of a pirate bottoms. Like, pirate bottoms? Pirate pants. What are those called? Like, I don't know. Well, actually, pirates didn't dress like that. That's just some fallacy that comes from 1890s coloring books, but that's not important right now. So, yes, Captain Drake, originator of Skeletor's look, predates Skeletor, and in fact, he actually had a second action feature. Besides having a skull face poking out of a purple hood, he also had a spinning face, so you could see his evil side and his good side, or his, monster side. This was a action feature that was used quite a bit in Big Jim. It was used on Big Jim himself, and most notoriously on one of his enemies, Zorak, who could change from an evil green monster into a human form, like Captain Drake after him. So the whole face-changing mechanisms of spinning the face around that eventually did go on to Captain Drake originated with Zorak, and obviously not talking about the hardest working mantis in show business. We're talking about the other pirate character. And this was highly publicized as, a very innovative action feature. Again, both the good guy and the bad guy had this. And this action feature of a changing face, where have we also seen this? Oh, lo and behold, it shows up in the Masters of the Universe line. A perfect example of a successful action feature that's already been proven at market, and then just adapting that into a new toy to keep the action feature at market. This happens all the time. Now, another huge influence, and one that can't be neglected, if you look at this image here, that looks a lot like Manny Faces that we just left. Well, this comes from Jack Kirby's Fourth World New Gods books. Why are we diving into this? Well, before Masters of the Universe was designed at Mattel, Mattel designers spent almost 2 years designing a Jack Kirby Fourth World action figure line. This line included figures and play sets and vehicles. Extensive resources, extensive man hours were spent on this. So, much like talked about earlier, when you spend a lot of time on a concept and it doesn't make it to market, and you fleshed out how the figures work, how the vehicles work, all even packaging concepts were designed. This wasn't just a pitch. This was actually a huge amount of work. And when you've spent this much time, looking at all of the New Gods art and designing toys based on this, of course you want this experience to pay off and actually make it to market, because you spent so much time invested in it. Well, lo and behold, that's why so many concepts from Jack Kirby's art and the New Gods absolutely show up and are reflected in the Masters of the Universe line, because, 2 years spent doing this, and you can see, concepts that could be Skeletor and Beastman, or He-Man on Battle Cat, or any number of Masters of the Universe vehicles that have so much personification in the design. So, is that the right term? To personify a vehicle? Well, I guess animal aspects of the vehicle, faces, giant wheels, all of that came from Kirby's art. And even things like Metron flying around in his Mobius chair, you can see that in Zodak, a very quick late add into the first wave of figures from 1982, who also flew around in a floating chair. He spent all his time working on this type of artwork and getting influenced on how to make toys. It's going to sort of seep through and go somewhere. So yeah, artists at Mattel were already familiar with the concept of warriors riding around on dogs and cats. So it made sense then when we're actually going to get into that in a moment, when the cat tool came along, that He-Man riding on it made sense, because a 6-inch figure could do that. And if you flip through New Gods comic books, you will see characters that look exactly like people like Manny Faces or like Mechaneck. All of their designs, their armor, Zodak's goggles, those are lifted right from Kirby. All right, let's get back to Mattel toys that actually made it to market. So Big Jim's Pack, which was the final sort of Big Jim push in the late 70s, when Big Jim became more of like kind of an Avengers, X-Men kind of team. Well, he had, all of his characters had code names, and they had features and special weapons. You will note one of them was Double Trouble, a line that shows up in the Princess of Power line. So many of these characters, like Torpedo Fist here, you can see the action features developed for this line, very successful at market, copy, paste, repeat, and shows up in the Masters of the Universe line, in this case as Fisto. Granted, the action figure feature worked a little bit different, but the idea of a character with a giant metal arm, or a bad guy with a metal fist, shows up as Jitsu in the Masters of the Universe line. All of the same designers that were working on Big Jim were still at Mattel for Masters of the Universe. And while the whip didn't exactly show up as Beastman, well, his whip did. And I don't mean that figuratively, I mean that literally, because the actual whip tool, the accessory that Beastman has, is the whip's whip. They just literally just took that tool and stuck it in with Beastman. So, yeah, and boy, the whip had a lot of accessories. Of course, most notorious is the Big Jim Iron Jaw character who, while he never made it to market, really actually emphasizes this point. He shows up in Masters of the Universe as Trapjaw. And this is an excellent example because here you have in Iron Jaw, in the Big Jim line, a toy that so much work went into and didn't make it to market. So the concept, even down to those giant eyebrows, I mean, the face is lifted right from this character. In fact, when you don't paint the eyebrows, like in the Origins figure, notice how you just can't recognize Trapjaw. He needs his eyebrows, and you can't leave them off. He's had them since his Iron Jaw days. So, yeah, this is a perfect example of a lot of work going into a toy, doesn't make it to market, and a way is found to get it out there in a different line. I wonder if Big Jim will ever get, his payback in Motu and be done sort of in a Motu style as a modern, highly articulated figure. That would be pretty cool, right? To sort of turn the tables. All right. Well, besides figures that repeated features of Big Jim and other lines incorporated a lot of tooling to the Motu line, and in this case, the animals. Things like the cats and the giant eagles were all released under the Big Jim banner, but not all of them were originally from the Big Jim line. It was very extensive, and obviously all of these animals were scaled to 12-inch figures, or 10-inch. Big Jim was 10-inch, I think. Oh, I'm sure someone will correct me. So you may or may not be familiar with Gore from the Motu line. If you are familiar with him, it may be from his Classics figure, since it's the only figure he's actually ever had at market. But the reason that we did Gore in the Classics line is because he was going to be a prototype, or he made it to the prototype phase. He would have been one of the beasts in the 1982 launch. In addition to cats, there would have been gorillas. And Gore here, seen in his prototype form, was a yellow-orange gorilla with black armor and a black axe. There was also plans for a red version that would have been the good guy version, and He-Man would have actually ridden on his back. So, much like Panther and Battle Cat, you had two different gorillas, a good guy and a bad guy version. But since we didn't get a chance to get to the red version, and only Gore made it into Classics, he tends to be more well-known. And while many people point to the Big Jim Gorilla toy, which was the tool that the prototype Gore was based on, well, this toy did not start off as the Big Jim Jungle Adventure Capture the Gorilla toy. They were doing a lot of toys about capturing animals back then. Rhinos, gorillas, tigers, a much different time. Well, this particular gorilla figure predates Big Jim, going all the way back to Mattel's Tarzan line. I'm not talking about the Disney movie. In fact, the gorilla wasn't the only tool that showed up from the Tarzan line in the Masters of the Universe world. So, as noted, the giant cat that He-Man rides around on, which conceptually was probably inspired by the Fourth World art, well, the tool for this cat, while often incorrectly noted as being from the Big Jim on the Tiger Trail, again, set where you're capturing a tiger in a cage, because that's wholesome, imaginary fun for kids, right? Going out and being an animal poacher, go get some ivory, kids. That's healthy. Yeah, all right. Anyway, so yes, so while as a tiger came from Tiger Trail, the tool was originally the jungle cat from Tarzan, a panther. So, yeah, it also predates Big Jim, and this is the actual origin of the Battle Cat tool. You'll note that he was scaled to that larger figure, but hey, popping a He-Man on a tiger, it looks very fantasy. And the same thing happened with the bird tool. Now, the bird tool from Motu, which was both Zor and Screech, went on, well, it did start with Big Jim, actually, to back up. So, unlike the previous animals that had the Tarzan origin, the eagle came with multiple Big Jim sets, which is why there's actually multiple decos of the vintage eagle floating around. There's both a bald eagle version, and then there's the one that has, I guess, more brown feathers and doesn't have, well, actually, there's the brown feathers on the back tail, and then the brown feathers on the neck. And yes, 2 packs, packs that didn't come with a figure. Here's the one with the brown feathers on his head. So the tool got repainted several times in multiple Big Jim Eagle sets, sometimes called Danger at Eagle Mountain. Sometimes the eagle was the friend, sometimes the eagle was the attacker. Either way, that's where the tool came from. And much like the cats, even though the eagle was scaled to a larger figure, it worked for Motu because it was a fantasy line. So you could have a giant eagle or a giant cat. Originally, Zor wasn't the sorceress. Zor was a legitimate character who hung out with He-Man and helped him and stuff. So yeah, you can see in the birds video I did a while back, kind of going into that. So yeah, Zor, the name, actually goes even farther back to a radio-controlled eagle toy that Mattel did previous. So hey, influences come from a lot of places, and there's no doubt that Mark Taylor saw a scary skeleton image in the Haunted Mansion, but didn't start with Skeletor. It definitely goes back to figures that predate Motu, but all of that success, that's so common in the toy industry because, well, designers are tasked with this enormous amount of innovation, and it's much easier to recycle, reuse, and reduce, and hey, as long as you're paying homage to older toys that came before you, there's no telling what the future can hold. I hope you enjoyed this video and it was a good look at all the many toys that influenced and led to the success of Masters of the Universe in the 80s and beyond. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Did you own any of these toys as a kid? Do you ever realize where they originally came from? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.